Your brain is not a hard drive. It's a living construction site that never stops building. Every skill you've ever learned, every fact you've memorized, every habit you've developed physically changed the structure of your brain. That's not a metaphor. That's biology. And today, I'm breaking down everything science knows about how learning actually works. No fluff, no filler. Starting with the mechanism that makes all of it possible. Neuroplasticity, your brain is restructuring itself right now. While you're watching this video, neurons are forming new connections, strengthening old ones, and reorganizing entire functional regions based on what you're paying attention to. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it's the reason learning is even possible in the first place. Here's how it works at the cellular level. In 1973, Timothy Bliss and Terry Lumo discovered something called long-term potentiation. They found that when you repeatedly stimulate a neural pathway, the synapse between those neurons becomes more efficient at transmitting signals. The receiving neuron becomes more responsive and the connection strengthens, meaning the more you use a pathway, the easier it becomes to activate. Neurons that fire together wire together, and this isn't just happening in childhood. Your brain maintains this ability your entire life. But here's the thing. As you age, it becomes increasingly effort dependent. A young child's brain rewires itself just by existing in a room. An adult's brain needs targeted, deliberate cognitive demand to trigger the same kind of reorganization, which means not all study methods are created equal. Some barely scratch the surface. So others force your neurons into genuine restructuring. The difference between effective learning and wasted time comes down to whether you're actually triggering this process or just going through the motions. And the single most powerful trigger, it's not rereading your notes, it's not highlighting, it's something most students actively avoid. Active recall. Here's the single most counterintuitive finding in all of learning science. Testing yourself isn't measuring learning. It is learning. The act of pulling information out of your brain without looking at your notes, without any cues, is literally one of the most powerful things you can do to make knowledge stick, and most people never do it. Here's what everyone does instead. They reread their notes, they highlight things, they stare at the textbook until the words look familiar, and it feels productive, but you're not learning. You're falling for what researchers call the illusion of competence. The information looks familiar because you just read it 5 seconds ago, and your brain interprets that familiarity as mastery. Then exam day comes, the notes are gone, and suddenly you can't remember a single thing, which is, not ideal. The numbers on this are striking. Students who practice retrieval significantly outperform students who just reread material. We're not talking about a slight edge. In some experiments, the difference in long-term retention is nearly double, all from simply closing the book and forcing yourself to remember what was in it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Even failed retrieval attempts help you learn. One study had students take a test on material before they'd even been taught it. They got almost everything wrong. But when they later studied and were tested again, they outperformed a group that had only studied without that initial failed test. The struggle of trying to pull something from memory, even when you can't, primes your brain to absorb it better next time. The format matters too. Free recall, where you write out everything you remember from scratch, beats multiple choice every time. Because recognition is easy. Your brain goes, oh yeah, I've seen that before. But reconstruction, actually building the answer from nothing, that's where real learning happens. So stop rereading. Start testing yourself. But even active recall has a weakness, and it has everything to do with when you practice it. Your brain is a leaking bucket. That's not an insult, that's just neuroscience. In the 1880s, Hermann Ebbinghaus mapped exactly how fast humans forget things on the answer is brutally fast. He called it the forgetting curve, and it shows that you lose roughly 50% of newly learned information within the first hour. Not days, an hour. Within a day, you've lost around 70%. You're hemorrhaging knowledge from the moment you stop reading. Spaced repetition is the engineered countermeasure. Instead of cramming everything into one marathon session, you review material at strategically increasing intervals, timed to catch the memory right before it disappears. You review one day after learning, then 3 days later, then a week, then 2 weeks, then a month. Each review hits right at the edge of forgetting, which is exactly where you want to be, and the data backs this up hard. Learners who studied vocabulary spread across multiple spaced sessions dramatically outperformed those who crammed the same material in a single sitting. Same material, same total study time, completely different results. Here's where it gets interesting. The optimal spacing interval changes based on how long you need to remember something. If you only need information for a week, shorter gaps work best. But if you need it for months or years, optimal spacing stretches out significantly. Your brain literally requires different schedules depending on the job, and the neuroscience explains why. Each time you retrieve information during a spaced review, you're strengthening the consolidation process, helping transfer memories from your hippocampus to your neocortex for long-term storage. Every retrieval episode reinforces the neural pathways, physically building more durable memory traces, but the real magic happens when you combine spaced repetition with active recall. Spacing provides the forgetting necessary to make retrieval effortful. Active recall provides the retrieval episode that drives consolidation. One creates the problem, the other solves it. They're not two separate separate tricks. They're two halves of the same system, and that system gets even more powerful when you stop practicing one topic at a time. Interleaving, here's something that's going to annoy you. The study method that feels like it's working worse actually works dramatically better, and I mean dramatically. Most people study in blocks. You do all your math problems, then all your chemistry, then all your history. One topic at a time, nice and neat. It feels productive. It feels like you're getting better with every problem. And during the session itself, you genuinely are performing better. That's the trap. Because when researchers tested students weeks later, the ones who mixed their subjects together absolutely destroyed the ones who studied in blocks. In physics courses, students who interleaved their practice problems scored around 50% higher on later exams. That's not a marginal improvement, that's a completely different grade. So why does mixing everything together work so much better? When you're doing blocked practice, every problem uses the same procedure. You don't have to think about which strategy applies because you already know. You're on autopilot. But when problems from different topics are shuffled together, your brain has to figure out what type of problem it's looking at before it can even begin solving it. That's the skill that actually matters. Real exams don't come with labels telling you which chapter each question is from. Neither does real life. On top of that, interleaving naturally spaces out your repetitions of each topic. You're getting built-in spacing effects for free just by shuffling the deck. Blocked practice creates a fluency illusion. You repeat one procedure over and over, you get faster, and your brain goes, great, we've mastered this. Then a mixed test shows up and everything collapses. You were training pattern matching, not understanding. Now, quick caveat, if you're completely new to a concept, blocking can help you build that initial foundation. But once you've got the basics down, interleaving wins and it's not close. Expect it to feel harder and slower at first. That difficulty is the point, but if you think shuffling your study topics sounds difficult, wait until you hear about the technique that forces you to explain everything you've learned to an imaginary 12-year-old. The Feynman technique. Richard Feynman won a Nobel Prize in physics, but that's not why people remember him. They remember him because he could explain quantum electrodynamics to a bartender. The man had a genuine superpower. He could take the most complicated idea in the room and make it sound like a bedtime story, and his learning method is built on one brutal principle. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it. You just think you do. Here's how it works, and it's only 4 steps. Step 1. Pick a concept and write down everything you know about it on a blank page. No notes, no textbook, just you and the paper. Step 2. Explain that concept as if you're teaching it to a 12-year-old. No jargon, just plain language and analogies. Step 3 is where the magic happens. You identify the gaps, because mid-explanation, you're going to hit a wall where the words stop making sense, and that uncomfortable moment where you realize you've been faking it. That's the entire point. You go back to the source material, fill those gaps, and try again. Step 4. Simplify and refine. Strip out anything that still sounds like you're hiding behind complexity. The reason this works is that it activates multiple learning mechanisms at once. You're doing retrieval by pulling knowledge from memory. You're building schemas by organizing information into structures that make sense. And you're doing metacognitive monitoring, which is a fancy way of saying you're catching yourself not knowing things. But here's the critical caveat most people skip. Do not use this as your first pass on new material. If you try to Feynman technique something you encountered 5 minutes ago, you're going to solidify incomplete or flat out wrong understandings. This is a consolidation tool, not a discovery tool. Learn the material first, then use Feynman to pressure test it. Also worth noting, this method is phenomenal for conceptual information. It's less useful for memorizing exact facts or technical procedures. You're not going to Feynman technique your way through the periodic table, but for understanding why something works the way it does, nothing beats it. And understanding is only half the battle, because even if you know something perfectly, you still need to know what you don't know, which is where metacognition comes in. Metacognition. Every technique we've talked about so far is useless if you can't answer one simple question. Do you actually understand this material? Or does it just feel like you do? That's metacognition. Thinking about your own thinking. And it's the single most important skill in this entire video because it's the one that makes all the others work. Without it, you might know about active recall and spaced repetition and still never use them because you genuinely believe highlighting your textbook for the 4th time is doing something. John Flavel broke metacognition into 2 parts. First, metacognitive knowledge, which is understanding how you personally learn best, what your strengths are, where you struggle. Second, metacognitive regulation, which is the ability to plan a strategy, monitor whether it's actually working, and adjust when it isn't. Most people have zero regulation. They sit down, open the book, read for 2 hours, and walk away feeling productive, which is, not ideal. Here's the thing, students with strong metacognition can pinpoint exactly what they don't understand, pick the right strategy to fix it, and pivot if it's not working. That makes them dramatically more efficient than someone who spends 3 hours reviewing material they already know while ignoring the stuff they're weak on. Well-developed metacognitive skills are associated with the equivalent of 8 additional months of academic progress. 8 months. From one skill. The problem is that most people are genuinely terrible judges of their own understanding. They confuse familiarity with mastery. They reread and highlight because it feels productive, not because it is productive. That gap between perceived competence and actual competence is the real barrier to learning. and metacognition is the only thing that closes it. Developing it isn't automatic. It requires explicit instruction, teaching students that confusion is a normal part of learning, not a sign of failure. Providing structured reflection where you actually evaluate what worked and what didn't. And here's the kicker. Students who receive training in evidence-based techniques don't just start using better strategies, they simultaneously stop using the bad ones, but knowing how to monitor your own learning is only half the battle. You also need to understand the system doing the processing and why it breaks down when you push it too hard. Cognitive load theory. Here's the brutal math on your brain. Your working memory can handle roughly 4 to 7 items at once. That's it, not 4 to 7 topics. 4 to 7 individual pieces of novel information, and then you're full. Everything about how you study either respects that limit or crashes directly into it, and this isn't an intelligence thing. Einstein's working memory had the same bottleneck yours does. The limitation is structural. It's hardware, not software. So, if you've only got 4 to 7 slots, what's filling them? Cognitive load theory breaks it into 3 types competing for those slots at any given moment. First, intrinsic load. This is the inherent difficulty of whatever you're learning. Quantum mechanics has higher intrinsic load than basic addition. You can't change this. It is what it is. Second, extraneous load. This is the villain. Every ounce of mental effort wasted on bad instructional design, cluttered slides, irrelevant images, and unnecessary information. It contributes 0 to your learning while eating up precious working memory slots. That textbook with 17 sidebars and a cartoon mascot explaining nothing, pure extraneous load. Third, germane load. This is the hero. The productive mental effort you spend actually building schemas and organizing information into long-term memory. When all 3 combined exceed your working memory capacity, processing fails. Information gets discarded. Learning stops. Here's where it gets practical. You can't always reduce intrinsic load, but you can manage it by breaking complex material into simpler elements first. You can slash extraneous load to make room for germane load. Activate prior knowledge before tackling new material because well-developed schemas get retrieved as single units, compressing complex information into 1 working memory slot instead of 5. Present information across modalities, narration plus visuals to expand your effective processing capacity. That schema concept is critical. It's why an expert chess player can glance at a board and understand the entire position instantly, while a beginner sees 32 individual pieces overwhelming their working memory. The expert has chunked patterns into single retrievable units. Same information, completely different cognitive demand. If you think managing your own cognitive load sounds powerful, so wait until you hear about a technique that literally uses your memory against itself to make it stronger. Retrieval. Practice. Earlier in this video, we talked about active recall. Pull information from your brain instead of staring at it on a page. That was the what. Now here's the why, and it goes way deeper than you think. When you retrieve a memory, you're not just accessing a file. You're triggering an entire neural cascade. The memory gets reactivated, reconsolidated with stronger neural pathways, and differentiated from competing memories that might otherwise blur together. Every time you force yourself to remember something, your brain rebuilds that memory stronger, more connected, and more accessible than it was before. Here's the wild part. This reconsolidation process is related to what your brain does during sleep, where memories get stabilized into long-term storage. Retrieval practice triggers a similar strengthening cycle during waking hours. It doesn't replace sleep consolidation, but it gives your brain a serious head start. But timing is everything. Test yourself too soon after learning, and there's barely any forgetting to fight against. Your brain goes, yeah, I already have that, thanks. Test yourself too late, and you've got nothing to retrieve. The sweet spot is right in the middle, where enough forgetting has occurred that retrieval actually requires effort. That effort is the engine. No struggle, no strengthening. And here's something most people miss entirely. If you test yourself right after studying and compare your score to someone who just reread their notes, the difference is tiny. But test both groups a week later, the retrieval group crushes it. The testing effect is a delayed payoff, which is exactly why most students never discover it. They judge strategies by how they feel in the moment, not by what survives. Now the real surprise. Retrieval practice doesn't just help you remember, it actively shields your memories from interference. Normally, learning new material can disrupt older material, but if you retrieve the older stuff first, it becomes more resistant. Strengthened, that's not a nice bonus, that's a defense mechanism. One more thing, combining retrieval with restudy beats either one alone. Test yourself, identify what you got wrong, then restudy those specific gaps, then test again, which is, not what anyone actually does during finals week. If you think this changes how you should study, wait until you see how your brain handles information when you give it 2 channels to work with instead of 1. Dual coding. Your brain has 2 completely separate systems for processing information. One handles words, the other handles images. And most people, when they sit down to learn something, only use one of them. In 1971, Alain Pavio proposed dual coding theory. Your mind runs 2 independent channels, a verbal system that encodes language as logogens, and an imagery system that encodes visuals as imagens. When you activate both at the same time, you don't get slightly better memory, you get 2 separate memory traces linked together, each one capable capable of pulling the other back into consciousness. This produces the picture superiority effect. The probability of remembering something follows a joint probability model where two independent traces make forgetting far less likely. If your verbal trace gives you a 40% chance of recall and your imagery trace gives you 35%, you're not sitting at 40, you're closer to 61%. That's not a small upgrade. That's a fundamentally different success rate. A concrete word like volcano naturally fires both systems. You process the word, and your brain simultaneously generates a mental image. These representations connect through referential connections, basically bridges between verbal code and the corresponding image. During retrieval, either bridge pulls you back to the full memory, two doors into the same room. But here's where people mess this up. Dual coding is not just add pictures. If you slap a complicated diagram on screen while running dense narration and on-screen text, you're not distributing load across two channels. You're carpet bombing both of them. Working memory collapses. The rules are simple. Present visual and verbal information at the same time. Keep diagrams clean. Never combine on-screen text with narration with animation, because that forces your visual channel to split its limited capacity between reading and processing the diagram. And this is why dual coding earns the final spot. It ties every single concept in this video together. It leverages neuroplasticity by creating richer, multi-channel encoding. It activates retrieval through multiple independent pathways. It has to be managed through cognitive load awareness, or it backfires completely. It benefits from spacing, interleaving, and metacognitive monitoring. These 9 concepts aren't isolated tricks, they're one system. Neuroplasticity is the foundation. Active recall and retrieval practice are the engine. Spacing and interleaving structure that engine across time. The Feynman technique and metacognition keep you honest. Cognitive load keeps you from drowning. And dual coding maximizes every encoding opportunity you get. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.